She set the lipstick mark on purpose, not the accidental smudge lovers leave in a hurry, not the flirtatious dab on a cheek, a deliberate theatrical print right on the rim of a cocktail glass. Serena cocked one eyebrow as she watched it dry, imagining the expression on a stranger's face when she leaned in for a staged kiss and ruined a blind date in the most public, humiliating way she could manage. It was petty and perfect, and for the moment, exactly what she needed. She had thought about leaving the city, about taking Nova and Cody to live in a cheaper neighborhood, about how long she could stretch a few months of savings. She had thought, too, about the night Father Tomas had said, almost kindly, "You can't raise 2 children on good intentions, Serena." That had hurt more than any eviction notice. This wasn't just spite, it was strategy. If a little scandal redirected the world's attention for a week, maybe Jesse could call in a favor. Maybe a new job would open. Maybe the person setting Serena up with the blind date, their neighbor with the well-meaning matchmaking habit, would find a new victim. A ruined date, a laugh at someone else's expense, and the heat would be off them for a little while. She'd practiced the kiss in her head while tucking Nova's hair behind her ear, and while patching a rip in Cody's backpack. She'd imagined the perfect timing, the angle, the little gasp from a crowded restaurant when a bold woman took what she wanted. She'd done bolder things before for the kids. This would be harmless theater. She had not imagined his face. He was not the kind of man who could be reduced to a type. Aiden Clayton had the kind of presence shaped by pedigree and decision. Broad shoulders, a jaw that cut away any softness, and the kind of quiet voice that made people lean in as if his words were rare currency. He carried indifference like an armor. If he noticed anything at all, it was that the world moved around him and that he was used to moving it. Serena had heard the rumors, Clayton, the company, the succession whispers, but had filed them in the same drawer as luxury I will never taste. When she pressed her lips to the stranger's cheek, the gasp that followed was not the sound of a man surprised by a kiss, but the crack of a world recognizing one of its own. The restaurant seemed to freeze, the chatter collapsing into a thin, incredulous silence. Her target, the date, sat beet red in a suit 2 sizes too confident, eyes saucer-wide and humiliated, ready to crawl under the table. The stranger turned his head slowly toward her, and, in that breath, Serena understood the scale of her mistake. Aiden's eyes were unreadable for a heartbeat. Then he smiled, not the cruel smile of someone who had been pranked, but an almost private, amused tilt that suggested a man who did not often lose the narrative of his day. "You certainly know how to make an entrance," he said softly, and the room inhaled with him. The cameras happen next, the way that happens in cities when one face belongs to money and another to mischief. A flash winked from body to body. Someone laughed in a corner as if they'd been waiting for the comic relief. Serena pushed a lock of hair behind her ear, cheeks flushed with the wrong kind of heat, and tried to tell herself it was still a stunt. It was still a joke. Except jokes have consequences in the wrong hands. By the time she and her date stumbled out, the thing had already metastasized. Someone recognized Aiden Clayton, someone snapped a picture, someone with very fast thumbs sent it across a dozen group chats and a couple of gossip blogs. The date got out of the car with the dignity of a cat dropped from a window. Serena got into a taxi with 2 sticky hands and one small, pragmatic plan: get home to her kids and never, ever let Jesse set them up again. She was 3 blocks from the playground when the taxi driver began to hum the chorus of a song. He was whistling without awareness of the other passenger's reaction, because how often did you find yourself suddenly part of a headline? Serena felt a phone vibrate in her bag, a small blue light flashing and flashing until she accepted that someone wanted to talk to her. "Mom?" Nova's voice was small on the line. Did you kiss somebody?" "Yes," Serena said before she could think better of it. "It was an accident, or not. It's complicated." "You kissed the man from the park last week?" Nova asked. She had that habit of narrowing questions to a single axis, seeking the simplest truth. "The man with the black coat?" "Yes, sweetheart, I kissed him," she said, and pressed the phone against her shoulder so she could see the streetlights swing by. "I'll explain when I get home." Serena's home, for as much as the word applied to a small, stubborn apartment, was a community of hand-me-down furniture and the sort of warmth that comes from people who can't afford to be anything but generous. Nova, No, not Nova Clayton, not yet, sat at the kitchen table with a stack of textbooks and a pair of needles she used for practice. Cody, who called himself Spade J online and wore a lopsided grin like a permanent signature, was half under the couch, fixing a cable. Their life was an unglamorous knot threaded by necessity and laughter and late-night pancakes. "Did you ruin the blind date?" Cody asked without looking up. He had a talent for saying things like a prosecutor while making them sound like casual observation. He was 16, wiry, quick with a joke, and quicker still with fingers that tapped keys like they belonged on a different planet. He had a black laptop with a sticker that read Spade J and a room full of cables that gave him the pores of an internet whisperer. "No," Serena said. "I performed an extreme social experiment to create a small scandal." Cody's eyebrows lifted. Nova's shoulders twitched as if she were about to laugh and cry at once. "You did what?" "It's called surviving on the margins, sweetie," Serena said, and for the first time in months, the three of them shared something that felt like relief. That was short-lived. 2 hours later, a sharp knock at their door stopped the oven timer and the conversation mid-bite. Jessie, godmother and professional problem solver, stood in the hallway with her coat collar up and a look that said she had news that would not be small. Jessie had been a fixture in Serena's life since the day she'd bounced a baby Nova into each other's arms at a church bake sale and promised they'd look out for one another. She was fierce, endlessly practical, and occasionally had a way of making Serena feel like she could walk through fire. "You kissed a Clayton," Jessie said, because she did not waste words on preambles. Her eyes darted once to the living room window to check for tails. "Not just any Clayton, Aiden Clayton." "We know who he is," Cody said. His voice had a new quality to it, something like a cable being plugged into a port that expected high voltage. He already had his phone out. "That's not the problem," Jessie said. "Madame Clayton will have noticed. She notices everything. Aiden's family, they manage legacies. They're obsessed with heirs. If Madonna's been planning her garden party, then she'll be thinking about bloodlines and the way those lines meet at dinner tables. If she thinks there's a chance, just a chance, that your children are connected to that line, they will move like vultures." "You think she noticed us kissing?" Serena asked. She could feel her mouth drying, a familiar flavor of panic. "I think she noticed a ripple," Jessie said. "And ripples make waves in their pond. Serena, be careful. If Clayton's name is whispered in connection with your children, you won't like the way people look at you." They were not prepared for how quickly that whisper would become a shout. Within hours, Serena had phone calls she'd never expected. An elegantly curt letter, hand-delivered in a black envelope, suggested that the Claytons would like to discuss a matter of family concern. A small, grinless man in a suit, Aiden's butler presumably, arrived with more questions than a social worker and fewer pleasantries. He was polite, immaculately patient, and completely unblinking about the implications of the visit. "It would be in everyone's best interest to be transparent," he said, as if speaking from the pamphlet of public relations. Serena wanted to tell him that transparency didn't involve stripping a family of privacy when their priority was survival. Instead, she invited him in and made tea. Her hands shook under the surface of practiced hospitality. Nova watched him without blinking, drills laid out on the table like tiny sentinels. Cody brought the butler a glass of water and considered including a tech device for good measure, then thought better of it. The next morning, Aiden called. He did not call with the brittle, clipped tones of a man demanding explanation. He called with the cadence of someone observing consequences as if they were still a puzzle to be solved. He mentioned the restaurant, the kiss, the newspapers, and the amusement he found in them, like he was offering Serena a courtesy, an option, not a sentence. "Do you know how this will look?" he asked. "I do," Serena said. There was too much that she didn't know. "Do you?" "I know people who manage reputations," he replied, "and I know how quickly reputations get mismanaged." "Then why are you calling me?" Serena asked. "To apologize for being a stranger in my life? To offer compensation?" A silence stretched between them that was not empty. When he finally spoke, there was a quieter resolve in it. "Because I don't like being the subject of public jokes." "Neither do I," she said. So, he said, "let's do this properly. This is messy. You have children. I would prefer clarity over rumor. Come by the office, answer a few questions. If I'm wrong about everything, I'll apologize publicly. If I'm not, then we will speak about what happens next." He did not sound like a man offering mercy. He sounded like a man interested in facts. That afternoon, Serena found herself in a lobby greater than her first apartment, under a chandelier that might as well have been a second sun. Marianne's face, the receptionist, was coolly inquisitive. Her heels clicked with a sonorous authority. Her help desk smelled faintly of citrus and old money. Serena clutched her bag like a shield and thought about the lipstick mark still faint on a napkin in the pocket of her coat. Aidan's office was quieter than she'd expected. It was not ostentatious. It was precise, like someone had chosen every object for a job and removed the superfluous. When Aidan stood from behind his desk, it was with the economy of movement of someone unused to indulgence. "We can do a private DNA test," he said. "We can confirm paternity if that is what you want, but it must be handled right. Chain of custody, respect, no leaks." Serena had always understood chain of custody in the abstract. Papers, legalities, but not in the intimate way that framed a mother's future. If a DNA result linked Nova and Cody to the Clayton family, doors would open and doors would slam. If the test said otherwise, she risked humiliation, suspicion, and punitive public opinion. "We don't want a circus," she said. "I don't want anything you might owe me. I just want to know where I stand." He listened to her like he was cataloging a new asset. What she feared, what she needed. "Bring them," he said. "We'll do it with discretion, professional testing. If there's a connection, we'll handle it privately." There was relief in the permission of that offer. But permission is not the same as safety. When Madame Clayton learned to notice ripples, she moved in long, slow currents. Her letter arrived 3 days later. A party was planned, the family would gather, and it would be in everyone's best interest to attend. The gist of the missive, appearances mattered less than continuity. Serena had never been to a Clayton party. She had once been inside a building with marble floors that hummed like the belly of a whale. She had not felt at home there. That night, she sat at the kitchen table and spread the children out like a map of lines to protect. Nova practiced with her little silver needles, rolling them in her fingers like a musician warming up. Cody tapped keys on an old laptop and hummed a lullaby like a tune he'd heard online at midnight. "Do you want me to make a scene?" Cody asked. He loved theatrics in the same way he loved codes, as a means to prove a theory. "I could release a statement. Spade J could make a little noise?" "No," Serena said. "We're not here to make noise." Cody's face softened at that. He had been born into a world of half-answers and abrupt goodbyes, and he read every adult in the room like a book he wanted to rewrite. "So we're playing it straight?" "We're playing it honest," she said, "and careful." At the party, the house swallowed them and rearranged its silences around their presence. Curtain folds like heavy breaths, a portrait of Madame Clayton that looked as if it had been painted by someone who expected histories to be obeyed. Aidan moved through the room like a man at home, not as if the world belonged to him, but rather as if he were the person charged to maintain it. He introduced Serena to people who nodded like their own names were weights and asked gentle clinical questions about where Nova and Cody went to school, who treated their illnesses, whether they'd had vaccinations. It was the sort of invasive politeness that indicates interest rather than intimacy. Madame Clayton, at 78, was smaller than Serena had imagined and larger in presence. Her hands were the hands of someone who had sewn a family with fastidious stitches. Her voice came flat and silvered with centuries of social maneuvering. "Children are a blessing," she said, and Serena thought for a second she might cry. The sentence had no warmth. "But they are also investments. Family needs continuity." "It's complicated," Serena said, and felt like a trespasser who had been invited to sit at the table and then told to wash the dishes. Aidan watched from a distance. There were moments, small ones, when his look softened into something almost bewildered. He stood aside when Serena corrected a misunderstanding about Nova's allergies, and then he offered an arm when she slipped on a stone step, as if the gesture cost him something to share. After the party, a doctor's news sliced through their fragile calm. Madame Clayton had taken ill, a fainting fit that had older relatives whispering about inevitability. The family's worry rearranged into urgency. They spoke of Dr. Horton in the same hush reserved for saints and surgeons. A master acupuncturist with an old reputation, a man who wore his needles like instruments from another time and whose treatments were as much ritual as remedy. Serena listened to the murmured plans behind the living room curtains and felt the old panic rise again. If Madame Clayton's recovery required a lineage that matched her own expectations, the stakes would rise. The Claytons did not move by accident, they moved by need. Hazel arrived like a winter smell. She was slender and sharp, wore her hair like a crown, and her words like knives. She had a smile that looked as if it required constant maintenance, and a voice that suggested she had spent her life learning how to puncture defenses with civility. She was new to the family's inner defensive ring, but had already proven effective at making people ask hard questions until those people preferred silence. Serena noticed Hazel at once. She was the type to measure others as if gauging their resale value. Hazel's eyes latched onto the children as if evaluating them as future instruments, and the look stayed long enough to make Serena want to protect them with a fierceness that surprised her. "What do they want?" Nova asked late that night, when Serena tucked her in and the house hummed quiet. Nova had the practiced calm of a child given responsibilities too early, but wielded with intention. She was 12 and already careful with other people's feelings as if they were glass. "They want what old families always want, proof," Serena said. "Proof that things can go on the way they've always gone." "Can we show them nothing?" Cody asked as he crawled into bed that night between them, laptop cooled on his knees like a sleeping animal. "I could hide things. I could make stuff look bad on purpose." Serena's hand found his hair and smoothed it as if she could reassure herself by soothing him. "No," she said. "We show only the truth. That's the only thing that makes me sleep." Cody didn't answer, but there was a set to his jaw that told her he was already assembling possible plans. He loved problems too much to leave them unsolved. A week later, the first real sabotage came like a whisper at first. Nova's notebook went missing. A technician at the lab raised questions about a sample switch. A security firm reported a camera outage in the parking lot of the hotel where Serena and Aiden had first met. Each small thing, when gathered, made a pattern that looked suspiciously like premeditation. Serena felt the pattern tighten around her like a hand. She could not, at once, show everyone the small network of favors and small deceptions that had kept them afloat. She had to play this with everyone watching and not break. She started with a meeting with the lab. It was brief and tinged with the quiet dignity of people who work under the light of science. A technician with a hairnet and a kind face apologized for an apparent mislabeling. "We're human," she said. "Mistakes happen. We keep logs?" "But the log shows a break," said Aiden's lawyer, a man who spoke legalese the way others recite prayers. "Chain of custody is disrupted. Someone opened a sample outside protocol." Serena felt it like a cold wind. Nobody wanted to say planted evidence openly within the walls of a house like the Claytons, because naming it felt like degrading the idea of family into something ugly. Hazel's smile never reached her eyes. Madame Clayton watched with a frosty interest, as if she were watching a storm unfold on a map. And then the assaults began, smart, strategic, and meant to frighten rather than to maim. First, a spiked drink at a small private gathering that left Serena dizzy and ashamed. She blamed herself until she found the little vial hidden under the napkin in her purse, its transparency like proof of someone's intent. Next, it was a shove in an underground parking garage, an anonymous hand that aimed at her ribs with the intent to scare, not to break. They were criminal acts disguised as warnings. Aiden found her the night someone tried to push her into the backseat of a van. It was Nova's scream, sharp and terrible, that drew him from across a dimly lit street. He moved like someone who noticed threats as information to be processed and then eliminated. He grabbed the man by the collar, and with a concise series of motions that left no doubt about his strength, he made the thug think twice about returning to his box. "You okay?" Aiden asked, his voice low and steady, as he steadied Serena with one hand on her elbow. She saw then, in the streetlight, the way his face softened, not from heroics, but from recognition of the stakes. "You don't get to tell me what I'm allowed to do about my life," she said finally, panting. She had a right to be angry, and she wanted the world to know it. He didn't argue, he only took out his phone. "You won't have to," he said. "If you want, I can arrange security, not because I want to own your problems, but because you shouldn't be hurt." He offered protection like an instrument, not a claim. That night, when Serena sat alone on her sofa and listened to the city flicker by, she thought of Ellis Island and of small, scrappy women who had arranged tables and saved pennies to keep children from the seas. She thought of her own mother, long gone, who believed in the stubbornness of small joys. She also thought of Aiden offering something that could be mistaken for a handcuff if she let it. She was not easily owned. Cody was not surprised to see the security sweep into their lives like a new furniture piece. He set Spade J to work differently, not as a loudspeaker, but as a quiet instrument. He traced IP logs from the hotel. He recovered a fragment of footage here, a timestamp there, and took care not to tell Serena everything until he'd made sense of it. When he worked, he looked like someone who took apart watches with a curious frown and then put them back together better. He found a gap in the footage from the hotel's corridor on the night of the kiss. Not erased, corrupted in a way that made sense only to someone who knew where to look. He traced a pattern. Someone admitted to the security system with a key card that shouldn't have worked. Someone had the forethought to program an absence. It was the kind of thing that might be dismissed by someone who liked neat stories. But Cody kept at it. He recovered a clip, grainy, just a few seconds, where a shadow moved in the corridor, and where the shape of a coat matched a familiar gait. It was not definitive, but it was something, an artifact in a sea of absence. He brought it to Serena like a trophy. "I can get more," he said. "I can pull the rest." "You pull what you can," she said, and felt a prickle of hope that she tried not to trust. She should have seen then the little hand that would reach for the trophy and snap it. 3 days later, the clip was gone. Not missing. Scrubbed. The lab log showed new activity, and the security company reported a software update they had authorized. It was a professional erasure, and it felt like a slap. "They don't want the truth out," Serena said, because sometimes facts have to be stated to be believed. Cody's jaw clenched until his knuckles whitened. "They're good," he said. "Someone inside, or someone with access, someone with reach." Serena looked at him, at the small, determined man who had been forced into early armor by absences, and felt a surge of protectiveness she barely managed to hide. Aiden, she realized, was not the only one learning to move his life around another family. That realization should have been private. It wasn't. Madam Clayton's condition worsened, and the family's eyes narrowed. Hazel's teeth showed like a promise. Fingers darted like insects in the dark, and an accusation began to take shape before any facts had been properly argued. At the center of the storm stood Serena, who had kissed a stranger to ruin a blind date and had mistaken the stranger for nothing. As the ripples spread and the shadows lengthened, she understood that the one thing she had wanted, to make a little chaos to keep her children safe, had opened a door she could not easily close. If she could not prove anything, she risked everything. If she could prove the truth, she risked drawing the family's full attention, an attention that could demand things she had not planned to give. She did not have time to make plans. The next move had already been made for her. Late that evening, a black SUV eased into the alley behind their building. Nova heard the sound first, a silent shift in the building's breath, and pressed her ear to the door. She had been practicing needle placements with a steadiness that suggested she had internalized patience and precision early. She knew the difference between a deliberate knock and a knock meant to push a lock. "Mom?" she whispered into the dark, and the house seemed to answer like a held breath. A boot cracked on the stoop. A voice, low and managed, called for Serena by name. It was an invitation to step outside. Serena opened the door because she had no other choice. A figure burst through the night, large and panicked. It took a second for her brain to catch the shape of limbs, the warmth of breath that was not hers. A cry tore out of Nova, thin and sharp. "Daddy! Daddy! Someone's hurting Mommy!" There are moments when time condenses to a pinpoint and then snaps. Serena felt hands on her wrists, saw a shadowed man shove her forward. He smelled of cigarettes and sweat and determination. His grip was not gentle. He barked words that could have been a threat or a plea. Someone had planted him there to take her away. And then Aiden was there. He had been light-footed through the alley, a silhouette who became solid when he collided with the assailant. He moved with a ferocity that had nothing to do with a headline and everything to do with a small life at stake. He pinned the man and spoke into his face with a calm that cut like a blade. The thug's eyes were wide, and then he was quiet. "You're coming with me," Aiden said to Serena with a voice both careful and absolute. "Now." "What?" she began, chest collapsing. "No." "Now," he repeated. He turned toward the SUV, but before they could reach it, a second figure stepped out from the shadows, thicker, more dangerous. He took one step forward with the interested, lazy menace of a professional. He smelled like oil and spent bitterness. Black Panther, he introduced himself in a voice that was intentionally theatrical. He looked like a man who had been paid to do unpleasant things and had catalogued them as a career choice. A fist connected with Aiden's jaw in an instant, a flash of violence meant to buy time, nothing more. Aiden staggered but did not fall. Serena's mind, overcalibrated for survival, thought too quickly through possibilities. Nova screamed. Cody came from the stairwell like a shot, but two men were already on them. Aiden fought with a precision that looked more military than social. He did not revel in violence. He used it with a cost. He dragged Serena into the open and sent someone running with a series of movements that made the scene look choreographed and ugly. When it was over, the alley had an echo like an emptied glass. The men were gone or subdued. Aiden held Serena close in a way that was protective and not possessive. He looked at her with a sharpness that might have been care if he had allowed himself the word. "You should have called the police," he said. "You should have done that before you opened your door." "I didn't know where to call from," Serena said. "I thought, you shouldn't be alone when there are people who would take you to make a point," he said. The words were not gentle. Nova clung to her mother's skirt like a talisman. Cody's hands trembled, but his eyes were bright with a kind of angry intelligence. "They tried to kidnap you," he said. "They almost got you. And they will try again," Aiden said, "if we don't find out who sent them." They did not know yet whose hand had brought the men in the alley. There were too many eyes and too many motives. Hazel's presence in the family was convenient. Robert's silence had always been full of implication. Fiona's adeptness at shifting blame was legend. Someone in that circle had decided Serena made a convenient target. Cody disappeared into his room that night with his laptop and a quiet promise to himself. He would do whatever it took to keep them safe. He knew which cables made noise, which networks ran on honest currents, and which could be diverted without leaving a trace. He did not have the right to protect them, except that he was the son of a woman who needed guarding, and so he had invented the role. Aiden stayed outside their apartment until midnight. He did not offer explanations beyond what was necessary. He secured the locks, made a call to a man whose name Serena did not know, and then left a card with numbers that seemed useless until someone actually needed them. When he left, Serena lay awake and watched the ceiling for a long time, trying to measure the distance between what she had done and what had been done to her. She had staged a kiss to ruin a blind date. She had not expected the powers that orbit certain surnames to flirt with the idea of her children. She had certainly not expected to be the target of an attempt to remove her. Trust, she thought, was something you paid for in a currency she could not afford. She had not been taught how to accept protection. She had been taught how to demand it through scarcity. Across town, in a room smelling of coffee and late hours, Cody tapped into a feed, pulling stray threads together. He recovered a piece of footage from a traffic camera that showed the black SUV, not a definitive link, but a silhouette that matched the men in the alley. He matched license plates that blinked like fireflies. He found a timestamp that didn't fit the official log. "You found something?" Serena asked when he finally surfaced. "Something that says this wasn't random," he said. "Someone planned it, someone with access." Serena's throat closed around a small, inconvenient hope that this plan could be exposed. If they could tie the attempt to the Claytons' inner circle, if they could prove deliberate sabotage, then the family that thrice noticed ripples would have to account for the tide. They also had no idea how deep the tide had been set. It was when Cody started to whisper the name of a private security firm, and when Nova, eyes gleaming with youthful horror, asked whether Dr. Horton could know anything about the sudden bout of fainting Madame Clayton had experienced, that Serena understood the distance they would have to cross. There was a network, a matrix of motives that would not be placated with explanations. There were people with reasons to tear apart any claim that threatened their plans. And then, in the small hours between midnight and dawn, when the city seemed to hold its breath as if listening to a rumor, Cody called from his room, "I found it." He sounded like a child who had just located treasure. Serena felt her own heartbeat in her throat. "You found the footage?" "A fragment," he said. "Grainy, but there's a face." He paused. "And there's a hand. It looks like—" The line went dead. The phone cut out like a prisoner choosing silence, and when she tried to call back, all she got was the faint tone of a connection that was gone. She should have panicked then. She should have called for help, and for police, and for anyone with a badge. Instead, she felt the slow, cold certainty of someone who had watched the world move to the rhythm of other people's plans and had nothing but her own small wits to cut through it. Someone had pulled a thread from their tapestry and held it up to the light. It might have been enough to prove them innocent. It might have been enough to ruin someone else. Whatever it was, it had been taken. Serena held the phone and for a second felt the full, terrible weight of everything she'd set in motion with a lipstick mark on a napkin. She had kissed a stranger to ruin a blind date, and in doing so, she had found herself inside a house that sheltered legacies and jealousies, within a family that watched heirs like trophies and moved to protect them with a ruthless care. She did not know then whether the people she had angered were protectors or predators. She only knew that the kiss had cracked open a world that could not be mended by a single apology. If you want to see how one reckless kiss upends everything for a family fighting to survive, stay with me. The phone went dead like a slammed door. For a heartbeat, Serena imagined Cody pressing the wrong button, the kind of teenager mistake she could forgive and forget. Then the knot in her stomach tightened until it was almost a physical thing. Cody wasn't careless when it came to evidence. He hoarded backups the way others hoarded photographs. If he'd called with excitement and then gone quiet, something had taken that eagerness away. She called him back until the battery in her phone threatened to die. She texted. She ran downstairs and out into the night with Nova at her hip, breath-making white ghosts in the alley lamps. There was no answer. The locks on the building clicked like a question she couldn't parse. Somewhere above them a siren wound and receded, indifferent. Serena did the arithmetic of fear. How long since the call? How many places he could have been intercepted? Her imagination went to the worst corners first, because it had to protect the children. Aiden arrived before the police did, as he had the night of the alley. He had come because he promised to pay attention. He had stayed because the promise had become a small, concrete habit. He held a flashlight like a conductor's baton and spoke in the short sentences he used when facts needed to be gathered. Where was he last online? He asked. In his room, on Discord, Spade J stuff. He was pulling hotel footage, Serena said. She tasted bile. He found something, then the call cut. Aiden moved without pretending calm. He contacted a man at the security firm whose number he had left earlier. He walked the route that Cody might have taken, his boots silent on the damp pavement. He treated Serena's terror like a problem that could be solved by attention and the right people. That was both the comfort and the thing that made her wary. People like him solved things with money and manpower. People like her solved things with split-second decisions and luck. They fit together like two halves learning to trust the hinge between them. Nova sat hunched on the steps, fingers twisting a pair of silver needles until they cried under the pressure. He wouldn't go alone, she said. He never goes alone when there's a risk. The sentence was not a theory, it was an observation. She had learned to read risk the way other children learned to read bedtime stories. A security camera a block over had static on the night Cody's call cut off. A classic story problem for anyone who watched networks for a living. Aiden's company could make calls that smooth static into something more definable. It didn't take long before one of his people, a lanky analyst named Mark, sent them a blip. A license plate, an SUV, a timestamp that overlapped with Cody's last ping. Whoever had taken the call had been thorough. They found Cody 3 hours later on the far side of the river in a service yard stuffed with old vans and the smell of oil. He was seated on a crate with his hands bound but not brutalized, the work of men who wanted information and meant to ask for it politely by force. He had a bruise on his temple and dirt in his hair. His laptop was in pieces on the ground like a puzzle scattered by an impatient child. He held his jaw when Serena ran to him, and the relief that flooded him turned into rage. They wanted what you had, he said, voice flat. They wanted the fragment. Spade J had a copy, but I had more. He swallowed. I hid a clone. Where? Serena demanded. Cody looked at Nova. who nodded toward the small brooch Serena had worn the night of the restaurant, an unassuming brass piece they'd found at a flea market. Serena had pinned it to her coat without thinking. Cody's eyes flicked to it, and a slow smile crawled across his face. "Not physical," he said. "I hid it where only kids look." He held out a tiny flash drive between his teeth like a secret, the kind of thing people lost in dresser drawers and never thought to check. Serena felt the absurd joy of victory and the exhaustion of surviving a night. She wanted to cry and laugh and throw the flash drive at Aiden's feet. "I could have lost you," she said. "We could have lost you." "You didn't," he said, stubborn, and she believed him. Cody refused help packing his tools back together. He insisted on doing it himself, hands trembling but precise. Aiden watched him with a kind of consideration that had nothing to do with power. The edges of his face softened when he looked at the boy who had taken apart hotels and put truth back together. Serena noticed the softness the way you'd notice a cracked painting in a gallery. Unexpected but undeniable. In the morning, they learned the first truth. Someone inside the Clayton circle had motivation to erase footage and to tamper with lab samples. That did not name Hazel or Fiona or Robert directly, but it made a map of interest. The map had teeth. The lab technician who had apologized for mislabeling now had her name in a file and 2 conflicting versions of an official report. One report said the chain of custody had been pristine. The other report said it had been broken, then fixed. Cody fed the flash drive into his battered laptop and watched lines of code like a person reading a language that told nothing of emotion and everything of possibility. He worked until his eyes burned, and then worked some more. He recovered a timestamp, a courier log, an IP address that pinged a private server, and then a folder labeled with a name that made his stomach drop into the chair. HCT chain 020. It was a report. It had names. There was an initial, a stamp. He read it aloud. The lab had run an initial private test in Aiden's office weeks ago, discreet, labeled private consult, and the result had said what Serena feared and hoped. The genetics matched. It was signed by the head technician, real and unambiguous. That document, Cody whispered, would change everything if it were presented in the right way. It told a story the current public reports had tried to bury. But the recovered file also came with another artifact, a delivery receipt showing that someone had physically taken a folder from the lab hours after the test and turned it into a courier who did not answer to ordinary verification. Someone had fingered the pages and then allowed a subsequent version to be released with altered conclusions. That was not a glitch. That was a crime. The problem was visible in a new way. The crime had been designed to look like a bureaucratic mistake rather than the violence that it was. The only people who moved paper like that in the Clayton orbit were those with motive and access. It was the sort of puzzle that would have fallen into legal hands in most stories, but this one had children who needed beds and a mother who needed people to stay awake for her. They could take the documents to a lawyer, but lawyers measured truth in settlements and signatures. They rarely unmade the small cruelties of families. These were people who preferred to settle storms with hush money and quiet contracts. Serena had no appetite for that. When she told Aiden the hour was late and the stakes were high, he stopped being the man whose world was a ledger and began to be the man whose world had suddenly become personal. "We will do a controlled disclosure," he said. The words were economical, but they smoothed something in Serena's chest. "Public enough that the family can't bury it, private enough that it won't be used to humiliate you." "Public enough?" Serena repeated, feeling the weight of rumor the way a drowning person feels the slickness of water. "On my terms," Aiden said, "on a platform that won't twist it. We'll hold a press meeting, but first, evidence, chain of custody, an affidavit. I will sign a statement guaranteeing the integrity of the files we present." The name Aiden gave to that day was not rescue. It was accountability. The difference was the difference between being carried and being allowed to stand. Serena found herself wanting that, to stand, not to be rescued. They made plans. Cody fed his recovered files into an encrypted drive and placed physical copies with Jessie, who slept the sleep of a person who thought she had earned the right to be unshakable. Nova rehearsed what she would say if asked about the family. She practiced kindness and clarity because she had already learned that adults often tried to simplify children's truth into something easier to process. Serena practiced a speech that did not sound like pleading. It sounded like facts. Hazel did what Hazel did best. She moved through rooms with the air of someone whose opinions mattered and whose friends mattered more. She planted doubts like pins in a map. She suggested a different narrative to Madame Clayton, that Serena was an opportunist who had staged affection for a chance at security. She created plausible whispers and then handed them to shallow listeners who would repeat them like evidence. Fiona, who had spent her life repositioning blame as if it were a kind of decorative skill, chose a different tactic. She became the face of reason, the voice that believed in due process while her actions orchestrated bad faith. Robert watched, silent and comfortable in a dangerous way, the sort of man who could be both bystander and director. Together they created a chorus that sounded more powerful than the truth. The banquet was set for a week later, and the scale of it made Serena feel like an insect under a magnifying lens. Crystal chandeliers hurled reflections across the floor like shards of truth turned to decoration. The room smelled of lemon oil and threatened memories. Madame Clayton had a look of fragile concern that made the air smell older than it was. This was the moment she had been waiting to secure. Bloodlines and alliances would be weighed and decided between courses. Aidan insisted they attend, not as supplicants, but as participants. "We will not be framed by their tone," he said. "We will set the terms." The plan was simple enough in outline and complicated in execution. Cody would feed the original test and the delivery receipt to a secure server that a trusted, independent journalist would access live. At the banquet, expected to be a celebration, they would play the recovered footage and the documents on a discreet screen, invite questions, and force the family to respond under lights rather than in whispers. The night began the way such nights often do, with the polite cruelty of old money and the low surgical laughter of people who had rehearsed positions for generations. Serena moved through the room wrapped in a borrowed calm. People nodded at her as if her presence were a design element, not a person. She watched Hazel approach with a smile that was all teeth. "If you're hoping for a quiet evening," Hazel said, deliberately affable, "you chose the wrong house to start one, my dear." "I'm not here for quiet," Serena replied, and the words carried further than she thought. They sounded like a promise. In the kitchen, servers moved like trained things. Servers are human too, and their conversations lived on the edge of accommodations. A young chef heard the word evidence passed and repeated it in the hallway as if testing it for truth. Someone overheard private test and misinterpreted it into scandal. Rumors had wings. They flew to tables before the main course arrived. Cody sat in a booth with his laptop open and Nova beside him with her hands folded like a silent prayer. Aidan was near the windows, a human anchor. Jessie circulated in heels that had not forgiven her for the day, ensuring the copies were ready and that the journalist knew the signal to project. Serena steadied herself with breath and with the knowledge that the children were safe. When the signal came, the projection flickered like a thunderclap. The room held its breath in a single communal intake. A black rectangle on the wall became a window to the truth. Footage from the lab, time-stamped, a courier moving like a ghost, the flick of a hand a brutal choreography. Alongside it, the scanned original document with the lab technician's signature glowed in the light. Undeniable, official, and in the right hands, damning. Conversations stopped mid-sip. Mausoleum silence is the worst kind. It is the sound of power startled into awareness. Madame Clayton's lips parted like a person who has seen a portrait move and must look twice. Hazel's smile thinned into something that looked like worry. Fiona's face went blank the way a mirror goes when someone throws a cloth over it. "That our family line could be questioned," Madame Clayton said, voice brittle, "is a slight I did not expect tonight." "You don't get to rewrite the sequence of events," Aidan replied softly, and because he was in the room, his voice carved space. "This document is original. The delivery receipt indicates that a subsequent report was removed and replaced. There was tampering. The room reacted in the way that prestige reacts. People looked at the person with the loudest name, and then at the documents, and then at one another. The slow, dull gear of reputations began to turn, and with it came the beginning of accountability. Hazel tried an old tactic: denial. "Those are anonymous files," she said. "Forgeries can be made." Cody anticipated the retort. He had thought of forgeries. He had thought of counter-arguments. He stood up with a calm that was almost theatrical for one so young, and held up another piece of evidence: a courier manifest and a security log from a camera that covered the lab's loading dock. People in the room who watched the footage saw, on a small screen, the courier's badge number. It matched a badge registered to an off-duty assistant who, when traced, was connected to a company that had done private work for the Claytons and for Hazel in the past. The air changed. People who had sipped wine left their glasses like stakes driven into the ground. Whispers moved like currents. Madame Clayton's face was a map of decisions. In the old rooms where she had sat at tables negotiating marriages and legacies, she had never before been forced into a defense that required clearing the table of her own chosen instruments. The room watched with an interest that had nothing to do with dinner. Aiden stepped forward then in a way Serena had not yet fully seen, less as a man with resources and more as a man who had just decided to be present. He did not carry a speech. He kept his voice to simple facts. "Someone within our orbit believed they could rearrange truth for convenience," he said. "They picked a mother with nothing to lose because they thought they'd get away with it. They are wrong. We'll hand everything to the authorities. But tonight, I will say this. I stand by the integrity of these documents and the integrity of my actions. If Nova and Cody are mine, they are still my responsibility. If they are not biologically mine, they are still—" His voice faltered, then steadied with a clarity that set the room tight. "Still my responsibility." There was a kind of silence then that made Serena's molars ache. This man who had once been a rumor in her life, had chosen a word that was not legalistic or performative. He had chosen the language of belonging. One of the Claytons tried to shift the subject. "Proof of paternity, though. This is the real point. We cannot have claims without clear, unbroken testing." Cody smiled. It was a small, dangerous smile. He handed the journalist a sealed envelope and watched the reporter's face as it went in. That envelope contained the original test results, the one performed privately in Aiden's office weeks ago and recorded on the lab's secure server. It had been signed by the head technician. It said, in unambiguous language, that Nova and Cody were biologically related to Aiden Clayton. The effect was immediate and seismic. Chairs scraped. Someone laughed in a way that sounded like choking. Sides of the room rearranged. For all the drama, some people were primarily curious. Would a billionaire accept children who might stain the neatly curated edges of a family? Others were calculating what happened to promise when bloodlines altered the ledger. Hazel's face changed when the words landed. She had expected scandal to be leverage. She had not expected it to be a confession that suited her only in theory. She stiffened, and in that stiffening showed the shadow of someone who had misread her ability to manipulate rooms. That is when the second piece of evidence came forward, a grainy clip Cody had labored to recover earlier and feared he had lost. It showed a late-night corridor outside a hotel room, a silhouette that matched the gait Aiden had, a coat flipped just so, the sweep of a hand that hinted at minutes that mattered. The clip did not need to prove romance. The test had done that. The clip only needed to prove presence. It corroborated the laboratory in a way that left little room for doubt. The timestamp aligned with a conception period that matched the ages of Nova and Cody. A hush fell. For a family that measured continuity in marriage contracts and portraits, the word match was an earthquake. Hazel lunged then, with the predator's speed of someone who believed exposure could be countered by attack. "This is a setup," she cried. "You people will have us investigated for slander. This woman—" She gestured to Serena with the kind of theatrical repugnance reserved for villains in books, fabricated this to climb. Aiden's answer to her was not words but action. He turned and faced the assembled family and press, and, with a single motion, stripped the room of pretense. He named the documents, he named the courier manifest, and he handed the whole file to the journalist, with an instruction to go to the police and not to let the story be buried. It was a public handoff that left no easy space for Hazel's denials. The police took statements that night. Hazel's phone pinged with calls from lawyers. Fiona's face thinned into masks of innocence and then into flashes of fear. Robert, when questioned, found the wall of his silence inadequate and snapped. He accused a security assistant who had been on the periphery for years. The assistant, frightened and cornered, admitted to swapping physical folders after receiving a cash payment through an anonymous channel. The channel led to a shell corporation linked to a private security firm that Robert had sanctioned for off-books tasks. The chain of custody break had a name, and names have power. The consequences were not immediate justice. Legal processes are seldom cinematic in the way people expect, but they were consequences. The company that had scrubbed the footage found itself under scrutiny. A courier who had once been invisible to reputations became the key to a warrant. Hazel and Fiona were questioned. Robert lost his chair on the board pending investigation. Madame Clayton retreated into a silence that smelled of old grief and of reconsideration. It was not the same as forgiveness. It was not even the same as victory. But for Serena, the scale had shifted from survival by trick to survival by truth. The shift was a small, enormous thing. After the banquet, in the quiet rooms where the chandeliers could no longer command attention, Aiden walked Serena to a balcony and handed her his coat. The city smelled at night like a thing that could be reached and not taken. He did not offer a solution. He offered a promise. "I will not let them ruin you," he said. "You think money can stop gossip?" Serena asked. She was wary of anything that seemed like another version of being owned. "It's not money," he said. "It's accountability. I will use what I have to make sure you and the children are safe. And if the tests are accurate, if I am in fact their father, then I will stand for them, not as charity, as responsibility." The word landed differently now. It was not a bargain. It was a choice. In the weeks that followed, the house that was used to quiet manipulation became a place where conversations could not avoid the new facts. Some of the Claytons reacted with the reflex of self-preservation. Pull close, fight back. Others were quietly curious about what it meant to have a man of Aiden's stature accept unexpected heirs. Madame Clayton observed like a woman counting the cost of inheritance. A few family members, who had built their lives on the tyranny of appearances, watched truth with an impatience that looked like relief. Meanwhile, Dr. Horton, the skilled acupuncturist whose name had been whispered like a talisman, arrived to tend to Madame Clayton in consultation with the family's physicians. His approach was not miraculous. He was a practitioner with decades of technique and a reputation for steady hands and steady counsel. He offered a regimen that complemented medical treatment, and in the end, the old woman's condition stabilized enough that she could attend the smaller family gatherings without the pall of bed rest weighing the air. He did not save her in any melodramatic sense, but he offered comfort and relief that made the family shift from panic to something more sustainable. The legal threads continued to unfurl in a sober, less cinematic way. Hazel and Fiona were subjects of internal investigations. Robert faced the possibility of losing his position. The security firm involved had their contracts suspended. The police followed leads, none of which made for immediate headlines the way the banquet had, but which together formed a backbone of accountability. Cody's tech invention, the small chip he'd been tinkering with since he was 12, caught the attention of one of Aiden's designers. It was a simple device with elegant architecture that could authenticate a chain of evidence in secure contexts. The company, always hungry for innovations that could prevent reputational damage, began to see value in those creative, kid-tinkered ideas. A contract offer came in an understated envelope, a partnership proposal with seed funding for Cody to develop a secure chain of custody system under the Clayton Innovations arm. It was the sort of opportunity that might change his life. More than that, it felt like recognition. Aiden watched Cody with an expression that had grown broader, softer. The boy who had once been a shadow in a cramped apartment was now being offered status and a role that did not ask him to abandon who he was. That gesture meant more to Serena than any speech about lineage. It meant a future where her son could use his talents without fearing the system that had made him hide. Then came the quiet moment that upended the last of Serena's guarded calculations. They were at home. No chandeliers, just the glow of a television and the soft clatter of dishes left from a late dinner. When Serena felt a small, unfamiliar nausea and then a warmth like proof. She timed it like a person who had learned to measure joy by months. The test was simple and private. When the lines came up sharp as lightning, Serena's hands trembled. She told Aiden first because the world had taught her that privacy with certain people was its own kind of strategy. She sat him down in the little kitchen that had no chandeliers and put the test on the table between them with a ridiculous, impossible laugh. "You're serious?" he asked, and surprise unlocked into something like childlike wonder. For a man who had measured decisions with the scales of businesses, the idea of a family expanding without a board meeting was disarming. "Yes," she said. "Looks like we're going to need a bigger calendar." The news rippled outward with the delicate chaos of a stone thrown into a small pond. The Claytons reacted in halting curiosity. Madame Clayton, older and less certain, allowed herself a small smile that resembled acceptance. There were questions about logistics and timing and what a child would mean for a family with layers of expectation. But the thing that mattered most to Serena was the way Aiden folded their future into his hands and did not push away. The proposal itself came in a way that avoided fanfare and embraced meaning. Aiden found a moment when the world had quieted and took Serena into a room lit by lamplight. He did not kneel on a public stage, he simply placed a ring in her hand, and the question beside it was soft enough to be an offering rather than an imposition. "Serena," he said, "will you let me be the man who stands beside you when the world tries to make you small? Will you let me be the man who, whatever the biology says, claims these children as mine?" Her tears were immediate and messy. There were words that might have been about money, there were statements that might have seemed transactional to cynics. But the love that had grown between them was not tidy. It had been forged in rescue and in the slow accretion of trust. She said yes, not to rescue, not to arrangement, but to a shared life that had grown out of danger and choice. They married in a small private ceremony months later. No banquet, no parade, surrounded by the people who had stayed. Jesse, Nova, Cody, the journalist who had held the night truth came out, and a handful of Claytons who had chosen to see a family as more than a set of portraits. Madame Clayton sent a silk handkerchief with a note that, for all its formalism, read like a benediction. The legal matters moved slowly, as they do, and yet the atmosphere shifted. Hazel and Fiona faced formal inquiries. Robert's complicity was punished by removal from the board and a public accounting that cost him what mattered most in that world: trust. The security firm lost contracts, and the courier who had been a ghost learned that small men can be dragged into light. Cody's chip found an early adopters market. The company offered seed funding and mentorship, and within a year, his design was being integrated into privacy tools for sensitive data. He would not be handed a throne. He was invited into a workshop where his talent could fit into a larger machine. He felt for once that his skills could be used without fear. Nova, for all her needles and early maturity, experienced a different sort of reprieve. She was allowed to be a child with responsibilities instead of being a child who carried adult burdens alone. She continued to learn under Dr. Horton's watchful but restrained guidance, and her skill with small instruments became a symbol of lineage that meant care, not command. The final joie de vivre came in the form of a small household joke when Serena told Aiden in the car one weekend that we should probably start a soccer team. He laughed, and for the first time in his life, someone laughed at a future he did not have to script for profit. When the pregnancy test at the follow-up confirmed that Serena was expecting not 1 but 3 triplets, the household nearly lost its patience with delight. It was an absurd, emphatic punctuation mark. The triplets were a surprise that read like life insisting on abundance. The Claytons, whose rooms had once been full of portraits and pressure, were now full of tiny clothes and redesigned nurseries. Madame Clayton, at an age when most of her circle would expect endings, found a small, curious pleasure in planning pinking shears and blue ribbons. The denouement was not without its bitter edges. Not all family members accepted the changes. Some withdrew to the corners where resentment is seeded and watered. Legal settlements happened without the theatrics of the movies. But the main arc, the one that mattered to Serena and her children, moved towards something like peace. On the day Aiden signed the adoption papers that would cement his legal relationship to Nova and Cody as more than just an act of emotion, Serena stood in the clerk's office with the children at her side. She thought back to the lipstick mark, the silly, deliberate, small wrong she had staged to avoid another day of setups. That mark had been a mischief that sent ripples. Those ripples had washed them up on shores they had never intended to inhabit. Yet the shore had become a harbor. Aiden, when asked in the graying light of a noon that smelled like a new beginning why he had chosen to stay, did not speak of duty or guilt. He said, "Because I was given the chance to choose my family, and I chose them." The final public moment came at a small garden party that Madame Clayton allowed, a place where judgment softened into memory. The family posed for a photograph on a lawn that had once been cultivated to claim legacy. Now the frame held an odd combination. A woman who had kissed a stranger with intent to ruin a blind date, a man who had once been a rumor and had now chosen to be a sanctuary, 2 children who had once been shadows, and 3 small cushions of life tucked under Serena's heart like secret warmth. When the camera clicked and the image was taken, there was a small chorus of laughter and a ripple of noise like a life rediscovering its sound. The business of the Claytons continued. The legal machinery retooled and adjusted. Cody's company made cautious deals. But in the middle of those pragmatic motions was a real thing, the choice to love across divides. Serena thought often of that first mad kiss, the absurd theatrical kiss that had been a strategy and a dare. She thought of it less as mischief now, and more as an opening, a way she had forced the world to notice. She had not expected that the world would answer with arms, but it did. And when it did, it required courage she had not known she possessed. In the quiet of their home, sometimes Aiden would catch Serena looking at the children, at the small, unlikely constellation that had filled their life. He would fold his hand into hers and say simply, "This was not how I planned my life." "Neither did I," she would reply, and they would both laugh at the old arrogance of plans made by tidy people. In the end, the scandal had been a false gravity that pulled them into a truth stronger than rumor. The people who had tried to manipulate fate found themselves exposed. The children who had once feared the dark now slept under blankets stitched with hands that had learned to protect them. The triplets' arrival, 3 small, urgent reasons to be brave, sealed a family that had been assembled not by blood alone, but by the messy, luminous work of choosing. If this story found its way to anyone who had ever used mischief to protect the ones they loved, or anyone who had learned to trust carefully, then it had done what it had to do. Show that sometimes the world rearranges itself for people who are willing to stand for the truth. If this love story moved you, like and subscribe for more twists and happy endings.